Hello, everyone. Um, we're back. Brandon and I are here for another episode of All Questions Considered. 4 weeks running, so we're gathering a little bit of steam. This is just a weekly time to engage our curiosity, to sit in the discomfort of not having an easy answer, and to learn to love and live the questions themselves. So it's all about questions and all about ideally some of your questions. We put together some questions and topics, but we love when you send some our way. I'm Drew Ingram. I'm the pastor at Spirit in the Hills Lutheran Church. I'm here with my longtime friend Brandon, and we're doing some of what we love to do, which is kind of sit with questions and explore some theological topics and just kind of the big questions of life. We wanted to kind of open this space up and invite you all into it. So tonight is part 2 of our question, Evangelical.
I like that it's just a one-word question.
Sometimes it's that simple, right? But that's generally the topic, right? Is what is this word? It's used in political spheres. It's used in religious spheres. We're going to open that up. Where did it come from? It's in the name of my denomination. All of this kind of, it has a lot of different kinds of interpretations, a lot of feelings wrapped up in this word. So we're going to be talking about evangelical, the word, the people, the movement. What is it?
Whatever y'all want to ask about it.
That's
right.
I
know I'm loaded with questions. Also, Drew, is it public that people can see your title, at least on our end, of Evangelical Part 2, ReligioPolitical Boogaloo?
Yes.
Is that public or is that just for us?
No, I think it should be in the show name for right now.
And well, if it's not, I wanted to make sure that it was known that this is Part 2, ReligioPolitical Boogaloo.
Yes.
Boogaloo?
I don't know.
That's my question for tonight.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce? Yes, I'm very excited about this topic and nervous about it because it hits close to home. I'm trying to figure out. I'm hoping by the end of this, I have my question answered of, am I an evangelical Christian? So I'm excited.
Well, a couple of quick things that I want to share with folks about stuff we've got going on. So first, I'm going to put up this little reminder, this ticker on the bottom that says, hey, you should share your questions in the chat. We'd love your questions, especially about evangelicals. You can share them at any point tonight, or if you're watching this later. And then if you've got other questions. So one of the neat things that I've had so far is just opening up this space to ask questions about certain topics. I've also received questions, and I know you have too, about other topics, about more general topics about God, faith, and life, or things that weren't like an episode title or topic. For example, there's a great one that we got on other ancient religious myths from like ancient Egypt, and how do they relate? And some of them have a lot of similarities to even like the story of Jesus, right? And to each other. And so that's a fantastic question. We haven't had an episode about that, but we want to. And so even if you have other, big looming questions, we'd love to hear them. In fact, that's how we got the topic evangelical, is we were talking in episode 2. We did faith and flag, and just, what's the religious landscape of our country? How are church and state related? Some of those kinds of questions. And somebody said, hey, can you talk more about this word evangelical? I hear it all the time. Don't know that I know exactly what it means. I'd love to hear you talk more about it. So please do share your questions and your thoughts on other topics. And then one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot, sort of offline, is faith and parenting. And what is it like? What's the parent's role in sharing faith, teaching faith? How do you pass on the faith? How do you how do you answer questions that you may not have an answer to, right? How do you respond to a question from a kid that you may not have an answer to? What do you do? So we're working on some stuff, and we're going to have probably like a series, both of All Questions Considered and maybe even some standalone videos about different topics within faith and parenting. And with that, as we get started on that, we've got some things in the works for an in-person event. If you're out here in the kind of West Austin area and you want to talk about faith and parenting, we're going to have an opportunity in early August. We're still nailing down details, but that first week of August before school starts, because we know that gets crazy as parents. But we want to talk about what it's like, and maybe even what it's like to be a parent and want to say something about introducing faith or God to your kid, but not having all the answers. And that's kind of what the show's about. And we want to extend that invitation. How do you talk about something we don't have all the answers?
Yeah, this is good practice for me as a new parent because my kid can't talk yet. But you're modeling for me how when my kid starts having questions about faith, I'm going to be like, let's just consider it, buddy. Like, I don't know what I think.
That, I mean, people will, if they've listened to any of these shows, will not be surprised when I say things like, hey, it's okay not to have the answers. And maybe you can explore it a little bit and give some space for people to think about it on their own at the same time. But let's jump into it. So you brought up that you're hoping to understand where you fit in this evangelical.
That's my goal for tonight.
Okay.
I better walk away here with a concrete, firm identity.
Okay, good. I don't know that I can give you the fullness of that answer. But a good, I've been teaching a class on church history. We've been talking about St. Augustine. And he talks about how when you have a question that you can't answer, the first thing you do is you look inward at yourself. So I'm going to ask you the first question of the night then, Brandon.
Nice segue there.
Was there ever a time, if we're sitting with like, am I an evangelical now or whatever, is there ever a time that you would have defined yourself or claimed the title evangelical?
Yeah, interesting. So I grew up, obviously, identified as Christian. The church that I went to was a non-denominational church, so I kind of didn't have that type of denominational identification. But I think I kind of probably in my teens and early 20s would have probably loosely said, I think I'm an evangelical without fully knowing what that meant. I was just like, I think I hear that word in the air and I think I kind of belonged and fit in that circle. But by the time I really kind of understood a little bit more of the definition around evangelical was probably by the time I was fully in atheist land, looking back at what I believed, going, oh, that's what evangelical. So by the time I really concretely understood that, I don't think I would have. I didn't. So I'm not sure if there was ever a time where I fully, had the T-shirt and everything. But but now I think I'm still kind of wrestling with that as I've come back around to faith and the Christian tradition. I'm like, where do I quite kind of fit in that? Do I like the evangelical label or not? So I'm excited about tonight, asking you, grilling you with some questions for you to consider.
All right, bring it on.
So okay, let's go broad here. Let's start with, well, first of all, just a reminder for anyone who's jumping in, we're talking about evangelical tonight. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat and I'll try to work them in and throw them at Drew at some point. But I want to start, Drew, with what does it mean to be an evangelical Christian? Let's just start with that. I'm going to start wide and maybe we'll dig into different places there. But what does it mean to be an evangelical Christian?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. My answer, I'll answer this one. I don't know.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, so here's, I think I have some ideas, but I kind of resonated with you talking about kind of going on that journey of like, I don't know if I even understand fully what this label is. Or understood what it was. And then the more I learn about it, then maybe the spots I'm like, okay, well, I don't know. But I also know that sometimes it pops up in different spheres with different definitions in different places. And so kind of one of my thoughts on what it seems to me to mean when somebody says they are an evangelical Christian, an adherence to a certain type of belief, of Christian beliefs. So it seems to me to be mostly identified by an adherence to a core set of beliefs.
Okay. But so I would say, and maybe you would challenge this, to be a Christian is to identify with a core set of beliefs. Maybe not. And then evangelical would kind of be further, would it be adding more beliefs on top of the Christian pool of beliefs, or is it a certain part of the swimming pool that the evangelicals are over here and the other people are over there? But anyways, you're saying it seems to be a belief-based boundary or definition.
Right. Like if we were going to, create demographics for a survey, the type of thing you'd be looking for in someone to say, are you this or not, would be a certain subset of beliefs in Christianity. Because you're looking for like it seems to me that there are people who identify as Christian, but not evangelical in the sense of what the word has come to mean in American Christianity in the last century. And but there are probably there are probably a wide variety still of people who would claim that title. So I don't know how small that subset goes.
Sure. Like any kind of trying to narrow down a demographic, there's always going to be people who kind of don't fit kind of quite neatly into it. People who maybe believe the things but don't use the title. People who use the title but don't quite fit into that. But we're going to use a general set of kind of beliefs here. Okay, so I want to know, do you want to talk about what these beliefs are?
Yeah.
And let's start with that.
So what are these beliefs? That was kind of my question, right? So I started with kind of the answer that I just gave, which is like, I don't really know. But as I think about it, it seems to be that there's this core set of beliefs that's a subset, or they're placing special emphasis on certain aspects of the Christian faith. But it was hard for me to kind of nail those down. So I did some research, which is one of my favorite things to do when you don't know the answer to a question. What a world we're in, right? Where like, as much as on the one hand, I love to do stuff like this, where you kind of sit in that I don't know the answer. We also in a world where we've got the library of the world at our fingertips.
You're right.
In some ways.
Is
right?
researching breaking the rules of all questions considered or not? There's a question.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay,
well,
but for this, it's helpful.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what are there? How many beliefs are we talking about? 2 beliefs, 3 beliefs, 20 beliefs?
So what I found, this was kind of so. Let me actually. I want to answer one more thing. So you talked about coming from the non-denominational world of Christianity. I come from a denominational world. Like I have denominational roots in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is my denomination. And so it's interesting for me because when I think about something like evangelicals, or even when I think about like the broad term non-denominational, there are certain similarities and like groupings that I could make where I'm like, but aren't you like a denomination with another label, right?
Sure.
And I think not exactly, but I just want to share that like that's sometimes where my brain goes, coming from the world of denominations.
What makes me laugh is like the word denomination is kind of like a denominate to unname. And so to be non-denominate, it's kind of a double negative of to non-dename I think it's kind of a funny thing, but it also, in many cases can kind of take on its own new identity and denomination of where the not denomination. So I love it.
So what I found though, is that there is this group called the National Association of Evangelicals.
They sound like the right people to ask about what does it mean to be an evangelical.
Right. It seems to me like they actually probably do have at least an answer, if not, the answer. The group started in 1942. I talked a little. If you want to know like more details on some of this stuff, I did do like 10 minutes on definitions of around evangelical in episode 3. So that was part 1. This is why it's part 2.
ReligioPolitical Boogaloo. Yeah. You need to say that every time.
Okay, sorry. This is why it's part 2. ReligioPolitical Boogaloo. And so they had 4 beliefs. I'm looking at my notes here because I want to read them the right way.
Go for it.
It's not,
I won't interrupt.
No, you're good. All right. The 4 core beliefs of what it means to be an evangelical, according to the National Association of Evangelicals. Number 1, someone considers the Bible as one's ultimate authority. Number 2, they confess the centrality of Christ's atonement, which is full of Lots of fun theological words. Number 3, you believe in a born-again conversion experience. And number 4, you actively work to spread the good news and to reform society accordingly.
Oh, that one's like an action-based one.
It is the one that has more action or practice tied to it out of the 4.
Dang. Okay, so to go over those again: 1, Bible, ultimate authority; 2, Christ's atonement is central; 3, born again conversion experience.
Yeah.
I feel like this was something that a lot of maybe evangelicals especially like struggled with, was like, did it fully take? Like when I confessed, when I believed, like did I have a full born again, what was it? Born again conversion experience.
Yeah.
Like was my experience on par with what it needs to be legitimate? And then number 4, actively work to, and I didn't get all the notes here, but spread the gospel?
Yeah, spread the good news, spread the gospel, and reform society accordingly.
I like that. That's a big one. Like you also need to be reforming society.
Well, but I think to me right away started to shed a little bit of light on why there's some confusion on like, where does this term lie? Is it just talking about beliefs or is it not? Why is there some sort of kind of political connection, right? Why did I use a word like religiopolitical? What is that relationship there? Well, there's something inherent in this about changing society according to whatever, the understanding of the words good news is.
So I'm still not sure how if I fit into all these, but I'm liking it. I think I like that it has action in there. It's not just a in your head thing. It's not just rearrange your mental furniture to be in the right group or to be an evangelical, but there's like kind of head ideas connected to your body, to your action. So I like that. Okay. So we have these 4 things. So to be an evangelical, does it mean do all evangelicals believe the same thing? Is this true for everybody? Is this a one size fits all kind of blanket?
Yeah. This I don't know. So here's
we're 2 for 2, Drew.
I know, right? Exactly. We're playing out of my field of depth. So 1, I'm going to ask you a question in a second. But number 2, I want to do the same thing that if you've listened to the first couple of episodes when we first kind of sit in something like here, I guess, let me just name my struggle. So normally with a question like that, does everyone of this group believe the same thing? To me, it's a pretty easy no. So like you heard me say, Christians aren't a monolith. Nobody's the same thing. What is a little bit interesting here is this is a pretty small, this is only 4 things. And it is a belief-based set of things with half of that last one being practice, right? Or kind of the 4th one being practice. So if it's about 3 beliefs, right? Like that's a pretty small and narrow. And so I'm like, well, maybe we're closer to a yes on this than in some other ones, because that doesn't seem like a whole lot of stuff. And then at the same time, I look at, I even mentioned when I was reading this, like number 2 stands out super quick to me. Number 1 does too, but confess the centrality of Christ's atonement, or even to stick with number 1, the Bible is one's ultimate authority. Like, does it matter the translation? Does it, are we talking about like the ancient manuscripts? Are we talking about, does it matter? Is the Apocrypha counted or not? Like,
this is how denominations start. Is like,
exactly.
Drew, it's got to be the NIV 1994 version, and you say no, 96 is clearly better. Right. And this is how denominations start.
Yeah, and so I mean, that's where I sit in the tension of this question, because it's like, well, it seems like there wants to be an effort to say, yes, there is a consensus of beliefs around these, 4 tenets or these 3 things. But at the same time, I look at each of those things and wonder, I talked about which Bible. I could say, what do you mean by authority?
Ultimate authority.
Right. Yeah. Ultimate authority. What
Yeah.
centrality of Christ's atonement?
There's a lot of ways to look at Christ's atonement.
Right. So,
Yeah.
so, that's where so I still think that the answer probably sits in this, no, because nobody, no group of people necessarily believes exactly the same things. But my hesitation is around this, wondering of, that there seems to be a desire to unite people with this same belief, believing the same thing seems to be part of this.
That's where I start getting a little bit of hives. So when it becomes belief-based groups, I get a little nervous. So I'm going to keep an open mind as we go through this. I'm playing around with it as we go through, because like you said, based on the definitions, maybe I could fit into the group, maybe not.
Well, yeah. And so maybe let me ask you this. If there was a time when you're baby, you would have been maybe not wearing a t-shirt that said I'm an evangelical, but maybe
way too nervous
somewhere
in school. I'm going to get beat up.
Yeah. Right. But do you think that your answer to this question, do all evangelicals believe the same thing? Do you think there was that your answer to that question might have shifted, or would you have always been yes or no, or would you have always been somewhere in the middle?
I think no. So for sure, hearing these kind of clear 4 things, I would have definitely been an evangelical. Bible ultimate authority, heck yeah. Centrality of Christ's atonement. What does centrality mean? But obviously, but it was huge for me. It was the center of the whole spoken hub and wheel and thing. So I think that was centrality for me. Born again conversion experience, I would have been it's important, and I hope mine was legit.
Okay. Yeah. So important that I question whether I really had one or not.
Exactly. The more important you make it, the more nervous you get. So there's kind of an inverse correlation there. Actively work to spread the good news in reformed society. Yes, absolutely. I felt this pressure, almost when I'm not doing it, I should be doing it. So yeah, I definitely would have been an evangelical. And now we'll see. I've got 10 more minutes to figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which,
I love
by
it.
the way, I'll plug now. If people have questions, share your questions about evangelical, which is great. We'll ask them tonight, or about whatever. And we'll see if we can ask them at another time. If you, like Brandon, are wondering, does this mean me? Does it not? I don't know. Did the definition help me understand if it's me or not?
It muddied the waters a little bit, made other things clearer. Okay, but so I love you asking me. I'm going to turn around and ask you, because I believe, Drew, you belong to, I think is it your denominational name? ELCA is Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, in America.
Yeah, in America, but yeah, the preposition.
America, okay.
We love our prepositions, but I wouldn't be a stickler for it in most. But yes, it starts with the word evangelical.
So are you an evangelical? You didn't even know what the word meant.
Yeah, right. If I am, man, I'm a poor excuse for it. Well, so here's the interesting thing, and again, if people have been in conversations like this with me, or you've listened to a couple of our episodes, this probably isn't a surprising kind of answer of I can read these and wonder if perhaps I can interpret them in a way where I would say, yeah. Here's the interesting piece, right? Let me just pull on kind of my own experience in interacting with Christians who at different points in my life who would identify as evangelical, or would certainly very strongly identify with those 4 parts of that definition. Born again conversion experience is not a major tenet of my denomination or my denomination's interpretation of it. Now, I have to be a little careful in that, in the sense that people would define born again conversion experience in the way that it became to be popularly known in the Billy Graham Crusades era, which is about the time that these tenets are being made and this National Association of Evangelicals is forming.
By the way,
and maybe a
I was,
prototypical word of like, I'm a born again Christian, like as a
yeah.
label.
Speaking of whether it was an evangelical, more proof. When we did a wax museum in middle school and we got to choose which historical figure we were, I was Billy Graham.
Dude, I remember that project.
Oh, do you?
I think I was Teddy Roosevelt, who
I
probably
know
also,
that's your Lutheranness wouldn't let
yeah,
you, like, you should have been Billy Graham or some, yeah, you
yeah.
were too relaxed
Well,
on.
but what's funny is I want to say Teddy Roosevelt probably somewhere in this maybe would have identified as in this place. I don't know. But
Now we're speculating about
yeah,
historical
yeah,
figures.
exactly. That's we're getting into too far into the realm of consideration of stuff that I have done no business.
Okay,
No.
back to you, Drew.
So
Don't get
yeah,
out of the question. Are you an
sure.
evangelical? You're part of the
So
Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.
so I would say no, as it is popularly defined in this nation,
Uh,
which is less about those 4 points. Though again, I feel like depending on how we want to interpret them, I could either say, yes, I'm about this, or no, I'm not, right? Like, yes, that's true for me, but also it's not. The Bible is ultimate authority, right? Like, I come from the guy who came up with the idea of sola scriptura, which is where, like, that's probably the theological root of that first core tenet, the
yeah.
Bible's ultimate authority. What's interesting though is like at the same time, Luther's like, hey, sola scriptura, but also sola fide, sola Christe. Like
Yeah, it
there were
doesn't make any
lots of
sense, Luther.
alones. I know. But like so that's this really interesting piece. Or like Luther would talk about scripture or the Bible as the cradle that holds the living Christ, like the Christ child. It's
Okay.
not Christ himself, but it is, or like this threefold understanding of God's
Ah,
word. So I'd want to say like God's word as one's ultimate authority. I would be much more comfortable with and open to rather than just the Bible, because again, the Bible starts to get a little fuzzy. And I believe that Christ and God are not limited to scripture, but are
oh,
found within.
gotcha. So God's
So
word is larger than the Bible,
yeah,
is
and
what
so
you're saying.
again,
Yeah.
I kind of sit with all of these and I'm like, well, like there's a way, but there's not. Is Christ's atonement at the center? Yes, but how are we understanding and talking about Christ's atonement? What model or theory are we talking about? And then I say compared to sort of some pop culture definitions. So I talked about this last week again in part one of our evangelical, which was just me, but I talked a little bit about there's like a pop culture definition that's like anybody who watches Fox News considers themselves religious and votes Republican.
Those are the three
That
tenets of
that's what,
evangelicalism.
yeah, like you're a Fox News Republican voting religious person, and like, oh, now I'm in, right? Which is really interesting because it's not at all these four things like officially outlined. But but again, that's where I think the confusion around these terms comes from. And I'm sure I am sure that there are plenty of people who identify as evangelical that are like, that is the worst trash definition of what an evangelical is, right? That's not at all what it means.
Yeah.
But and so there's like a lot there. Yeah, I don't know.
Well,
There are
that leads
times,
me to want to
yeah.
ask about how did that come to be? Like, how did we arrive at a place where evangelicalism kind of starts to equate to these other political things? And so I'm curious, do you know much
Yeah.
about the history of evangelicalism?
Yeah, a little bit. I know a little bit about the history of evangelicalism. For that, you really, I know it's got a very provocative title, but Jesus and John Wayne is a book that pulls a lot of history. I mean, I think the subheading is something like how white men hijacked America and like ruined a country and tore it apart or something like that. If you can stick with, like, it actually pulls out
I've
the
heard good
history of
things.
the movement. It is a good
Yeah.
book. It's a good read, especially if you feel like you can be in if it seems like something that's going to hit close to home for you, dear listener. If you can sit with it with take a critical eye to it, but be willing and open enough to listen, like you're listening to me right now. It actually like details the history and some of it. There are a couple of other resources around this move, but basically there were modernists and fundamentalists were the two categories of Christians in the early 20th century.
Okay.
And evangelicals wanted to be this third path, sort of in between
I
the
like third way
modernists.
stuff.
Sure, yeah, the in between the modernists and the progressives.
Oh, they were like the
Or sorry, the
moderates
moderates and the
in
fundamentalists. The modernists and the fundamentalists.
modern. Okay, so they were the moderate in between the two extremes.
They were kind of the moderate place. What's interesting is to see then how that gets shaped. Like even I think on the National Association of Evangelicals, they say we were to be in between those two groups in 1942.
Okay.
But by the time you're getting to the 60s and 70s, it's moving more and more fundamental, or you're seeing fundamentalists come into and become the popular figures of evangelicalism. So there's some interesting piece there. You also have, you'd have to go look at some detailed histories on like the religious right, RIGHT, which is how we get this association with the republicanism, but this way to mobilize voters as this is what it means to be Christian. These are the issues that Christians should care about. Big names like Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell and people are in that movement, identifying as evangelical, as born again, and identifying that with values that are picked up by the Republican Party. And they begin to kind of mobilize that sort of voter base and identify it as a voter base, a certain type of Christian.
Wait, what was the chicken and egg there? Which was it? The Republican Party jumps on the wave of evangelicalism, or is it that evangelicalism partners with?
I'm not qualified to answer that question. So I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to consider, right? Who was influencing who more? And then to consider that then, and also to consider it now, right? So like then if there's been this kind of loose association since especially kind of the 80s, but then how about 40 years later, who's like, are we starting with evangelical values that have been adopted by the Republican Party, or are we now have, the GOP convention setting up a set of like a policy platform that's then just wholeheartedly adopted by, how much have they converged or not? Who's influencing who? I think those are some really important questions, that it's in some ways it's really unclear, which is also, an interesting piece, right? Like that we can't tell, or that there is this association with, right? This kind of, that there's a pop culture definition of like, I watch Fox News, I vote Republican, and I'm religious. And that makes me an evangelical when that's not really what it is. And then, I mean, there's also a ton of, there's all this like political survey data on what do evangelicals look like as a voter group? What are they for? What are they against? They're more likely to support things. So that's the other piece of that, of like, more than any other demographic group, white evangelicals are opposed to immigration reform and hold more negative views of immigrants. 68%.
Just like Jesus.
Sure, yeah. 68% don't think that the U.S. has a responsibility to accept refugees. And so I bring those two up to say, like, you ask me, am I do I consider myself evangelical? Especially when I look at a definition like that, or like this group, that is not representative of my views. I'm consistently involved with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, which has been around about as long as the National Association of Evangelicals, and has been resettling refugees and welcoming immigrants. And that's something I'm really, really passionate about. But then I guess it kind of begs that question, right? Why does my denomination have evangelical in its name? If I would say most of my denomination were the people who started Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people in my denomination who would say, yes, any and all of these definitions, whether it's pop culture or from the National Association of Evangelicals, I am there. I'm an evangelical. I guarantee you there are people in most ELCA congregations that say yes.
Yeah.
But I think that the root where it comes from for us finds its roots much farther back.
Are we going to get into the history of the word evangelical? Because I think I'm a little bit familiar with this. Tell me if I'm right. Let me do this. Let me throw this at you, and you tell me if I'm even in the ballpark. But I believe it was a kind of political word, first century Rome. Tell me, I could be totally wrong here. I'm remembering.
Well, even older than that, like 4th century BC Rome, like Alexander the Great.
Okay. So here's what I'm thinking is
or Greece,
in
I
the
should say,
time
not
of
Rome.
Jesus,
Yeah.
this was a word that was known when Rome or the empire would go conquer new land, and they would come in to proclaim the good news that you are now under the rule of Caesar, of the Roman Empire. And so when talking about the word evangelical in that way, I'm kind of prone to identify as evangelical because I love this hijacking of that word of this empire saying, hey, we've got good news. You are now under the rule of Caesar and all of the horrible empire domination things that come with that. And saying, actually, we're going to use the word evangelical to proclaim the good news that we are underneath a different kind of rule, a different kind of kingdom. Am I in the ballpark?
Yes. Yeah, you're right on. So there's a Greek word, Evangelion, which
I wasn't going to try to pronounce it.
Sure, yeah, but it gets translated to Evangelion, right? Like, and then it just means good news. It means good news.
I like the jelly.
Yeah. But it's talked about, it's talking about specific types of good news. It's typically used in this way, but there are other examples of like a message of good news. It's usually like a messenger bringing a message of good news. So a good news of a victory, but also like there's some examples of like, your loved ones are coming to visit, right? Like here's the good news that, it's like there were.
It never was actually good news. It's like you've been conquered by Rome. Your in-laws are coming.
Yeah, exactly. But it just, it was this announcement of good news. It was used when you were bringing a message of good news. And so I'll give you one brief example of like, Drew, how do you know this?
Cite your sources.
There's the Preen inscription, Priene inscription, and it's dated to 9 BCE, so we're talking like right at the time of Jesus, right around the birth of Jesus, maybe just a couple years before, probably. Since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good news for the world. So in the Roman Empire and with Caesar Augustus, it takes on this like big overarching dimension, right? But the birth of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good news for the world, which to people who know the first line of the Gospel of Mark, you're like, oh my goodness, the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, right? And you're like, this is like, it's so close to exactly what's written and inscribed here.
Yes.
And that word good news. So it's good news. So when we talk about gospel or good news, that's just this word, evangelion, this Greek good news word. How it ends up in my denomination, you have to skip 1500 years later to the Protestant Reformation and the reformers who follow Martin Luther out of the Catholic Church call themselves the evangelical. So there are Lutheran roots. Like before they're called Lutherans, they're called evangelicals.
Gotcha.
And the Protestants and reformers. But there are roots to the first days of the Lutheran movement of this word evangelical. That's how it still ends up in like my denomination's name. Now I will say, if anybody who's ELCA is out there, especially if you're an ELCA pastor, like every couple months at least, somebody's like, hey, we should get rid of the word evangelical from our denomination. And then other people are like, no, we can't, because then it just means good news, and we want to share the good news, and we want to be evangelical in that sense.
Okay, well,
but when is that baggage? When is that like not actually representative of who we are?
When does the word good news start to mean bad news? And so I'm curious, I want to throw that at you, because there's this, I'm guessing the reason that these people in your denomination are like, can we cut the E in ELCA, is because it's so polarizing right now. Yeah. It's because this word evangelical has become kind of political in ways that's is very polarizing. So why is evangelicalism so polarizing these days?
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is that, interestingly, the word evangelical has always been sort of political and maybe even polarizing, right? Which is just this interesting nuance when you know the history.
Yeah, that's fun.
But I think today it's because it has picked up a definition outside of itself, right? Like it is no longer just defined by itself, and it's not necessarily defined even by sort of the root definition of the word. And because it has become so messy, so like unclear whether when you say, uh, hey, evangelicals think or whatever, if you're talking about politics or if you're talking about religion, because it's become so unclear and it's become so like rooted in pop culture to mean, again, right? Like whether that's like Fox News, religious Republicans, or even like beliefs that aren't those four main beliefs are also pretty commonly attached, like a belief in Christian nationalism, belief in traditional gender roles or traditional marriage, or sometimes there's this sort of halfway theological term of like complementarianism, right? Like men and women have certain roles and they ought to have those roles. And a patriarchal authority structure is pretty embedded in, like God as head of hierarchy, so man as head of household in a very hierarchical, patriarchal format. So like even stuff like that has also been attached. That's not, again, to the like to be clear, it's not in the official definition from the National Association of Evangelicals, but
it
it's
seems
in our
like
cultural definition.
Yeah, there you go.
And and I think that part of that is why it's polarizing, even for people who would claim the title and say, I'm definitely in this group. Because which of those definitions are they identifying with? And when somebody kind of bucks the trend, for instance, like if an evangelical Christian author who's like had several books published, then says something that falls out of line, not with those four core tenets, but with like another one of these other things, their books might start getting sold or stop getting sold by the publisher. They might lose a publishing contract or something. And when you're talking about stuff like that, it really brings up like, well, what are we actually talking about, right? Like, are we talking about this way of Christian belief or not? And it's that polarizing, like within the category itself, let alone, again, I think as soon as you identify it as a voter block, which our country has done, right? Like our media, our pollsters have done, then I mean, I read you these statistics. And again, I don't want to say that this is representative even necessarily of people who consider themselves evangelical, but it is
one of them 81%. I think I remember 81% of evangelicals, and maybe there's a subset of evangelicals, but of evangelicals voted for Trump in the 2016 election.
Yeah,
and that was a number that
white evangelicals. But
okay, there you go, white evangelicals. And it stuck out to me. It was like, oh, I don't know if I can claim, like you're saying, there's this belief side of it, of this stated, these are the four things, and then there's this whole other milieu that it's gotten connected to.
Right. And we talked about this in the Faith and Flag, but as soon as you start attaching your religion to a political party, we're playing in the land of like idolatry. We're playing in the land of worshiping political figures and parties or platforms and not worshiping God. And I'm not even, it's hard to see where, if there's blame on for it to have gotten this far, like where is that? Who shares in the responsibility for this? Again, there's this mix of the religious right and, this equating of republicanism. I think I mentioned even in that Faith and Flag episode, Pastor Greg Locke in Tennessee, said from the pulpit, you cannot vote Democrat and be a Christian. And his church lost its 501c3 tax status as like nonprofit status, as any nonprofit who makes that declarative of a statement about a political party or figure should. Like it's outside of the legal code for what a nonprofit can do, whether you're religious or not. You cannot endorse a candidate, or you cannot be partisan in that way. But like when you see that sort of identification of like, so like you are negating my belief in first century Palestinian Jewish rabbi, um, because of my, like, because of a vote in an election, in America in the 21st century, right? And like that's just so far removed from the Bible, the centrality of Christ's atonement. Like it's like, how does that even have something to do with? But it does, and I think that's why it's so polarizing. Is like when you have all this launched together, what is the word going to do except for pretty much all, like, I feel like anybody within or without can like point and be like, that's not it, and I don't want any part of that, wherever you are. So you kind of want to remove yourself from it and entrench yourself. And then what happens in things like that is then people sort of entrench themselves. Well, they're out to get us. They don't like, you sort of
we're
get
being
defensive.
persecuted.
Yeah.
So, and I feel this, this kind of relates to some of the other conversations we've had. I feel this about the term Christian. The term Christian to me means something pretty simple, and yet it's kind of also got connections to all these things that I don't think I'm okay with. And I get nervous telling people I'm a Christian because I think it probably means a million things to them.
Well,
same thing with America,
even,
being an American, like that we talked about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, even there's an interesting thing in our current religiopolitical landscape, in the midst of our religiopolitical boogaloo in this country right now, that like the predominant version of Christian in this nation, like how much are Christian and evangelical almost inseparable in public discourse, which is interesting because, right, like where's the nuance, where's the denominations, where's the, like, when my denomination gets together, we tend to call ourselves like mainstream or mainline Protestant denominations.
I like mainstream. It's like saying we're the popular ones, no matter what the polls say.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which is not, but like, that's not the case, right? So there's, the public discourse around Christianity is almost always talking about evangelicalism. And even when it's doing that, it seems to me that at least half the time, maybe more, it seems to be talking about a designation of a voter bloc or an interest group, a political interest group, more than it's talking about a faith, a set of beliefs, a portion of practices. That is one of the interesting things. Like if I were to try to come up with like the 4 core things of, to be in the ELCA, the first things I'd look at would actually be like our baptismal promises, most of which are labeled in a all of which are labeled in a practice language before they're labeled in a belief language. Now we still have statements of belief, but it would be like the creeds of the church, like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed, and the Scripture in the Bible. So like it's even that is interesting to see like what, and again to me is like, okay, well, is this a denomination, right? Like, is that what you're saying? The same way that you go to the baptism section of what we believe on the ELCA website, which is a mess. It's really hard to navigate, by the way.
Just really throwing the ELCA graphic designer under the bus, just like
the ELCA website it has a lot of information on it. It is really hard to get around and find.
Drop a comment if you know a UX designer who wants to do some volunteer work.
For real. This is we 3.3 million members in this denomination, and a website that is cumbersome with lots of fantastic stuff on it.
You just call that punk rock. That just means it's punk rock.
Sure.
Okay, but you're talking about the core tenets of to be ELCA.
Yeah, well, and we wouldn't even have it necessarily like that clearly stated. But I look at like basically our baptism liturgy, like the entrance rite into the church. And it's pretty well held in common across, again, these kind of mainline Protestant denominations. And so it's interesting to me to like see how this has fit in and around, and the confusion, like literally the mixing up of evangelical and Christian as like definitions that seem to overlap for a lot of people. And
Yeah.
also, well, like I even remember some of our conversations when you were like, "Hey, I don't know if like this part of the faith tradition I grew up in," and I'm like, "Hey, yeah, I've been growing up in this whole other like stream of the
And I was
Christian
like,
tradition."
there's other options.
Yeah, right. But all of us in our own place can talk or think like everybody's just like us, right? And so it's
I know. You like opened up my eyes. I was like, I didn't realize this was Baskin Robbins with 31 flavor. I was just told this is the only one you can eat. And so,
right.
so yeah, you changed my
And
world with that.
and so like, but when we get that level of confusion, right? Like, well, this must mean this, right? That's when we can get into this weird mix, right? Like, well, so is it religious or political distinction?
Mm.
Well, it's like, well, who are you talking to, and whose opinion? Because the media seems to talk about it more as a voter group than as a group of believers. But in the church world, they're tended to talk about as a group of believers or as a pseudo denomination almost, right? Like this other grouping of people. And yeah, and it just, I don't know. It's kind of it's still a little or still quite kind of entangled. So I don't know if I've even unpacked any of this other than naming some of that cumbersome and convoluted nature of this word, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's what we're doing here. We're making space. We're making space for all this. But the question that it's probably going to leave me with, because I like the roots of the word. I like where the word comes from. I like the kind of punk rock nature of like, we're going to take this good news word that the empire's been using and kind of flip it on its head. That gets me excited. That makes me want to identify with it. But then there's these other things it's kind of come to be associated with, especially in culture. And so for me, the question that it leaves in the air is, do I abandon the term and the identity because it's been hijacked or it's come to mean things that I'm not okay with? Or do I spend time and energy and effort trying to reclaim it? And, that's my question with the word Christian. It's now my question with the word evangelical.
Now, welcome to the last 30 years of ELCA clergy conversations.
Just like on the fence about like, do we
Just
keep
like,
it? Do we?
right? We should like fight for it because this is what it's supposed to mean, and then people are like, it's just not worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll probably go back and forth most weeks as well. So right now, though, talking about the history of it gets me like, you know what? There's something worth saving here in the history of this word. So that's where I'm leaning today. Later on when I accidentally flip through Fox News, I'll be like, you know what? It's a losing battle.
Well, and I think maybe there is where I'm sitting with this of how do we hold on to the word, and how do we take a word that was never really meant to be a title, but about, I mean, it literally means good news, but about a message of good news. How do we hold on tight to the good news that it refers to and to this word that means good news, even as we might need to get rid of the title piece of it, the demographic language around it.
Yeah.
But I don't have an answer for how we do that. But that's kind of where I sit of like, yeah,
No, that's
I mean, like
interesting.
this Greek word seems vitally important to the early church, like, and to the Jesus movement.
Yeah,
so,
but
like, we
probably
can't
none
get
of
rid
them would
the
have
word.
said, I
Right.
use it as an identity.
Right. Or I use it to talk about this news program that hasn't been invented yet that I like to watch.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, Drew. This has been fun. It's as always, I'm hoping to find an answer at the end, and instead I get to an even better question that I'm excited to sit with. So I love it. Thanks for doing all the research.
Yeah.
So that you
a little
so we
different
could
this
better. Yeah, but it allowed us to better hold and consider the questions.
Well, thanks. Yeah, we're coming to the end of our time, friends. Again, if you're with us now or later, please, or if you'd rather send your questions, like some of the way I got this one, somebody just texted me, and so we're happy. If you know Brandon and I, you can send us messages, and You can put it in the comments or things, or you can just send us questions about this topic that we can talk about, or questions that might include in future topics and conversations as we go. Again, this has been All Questions Considered, where we're considering questions, not necessarily answering them, because we don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. And it's important to learn to engage our curiosity, sit with a little bit of discomfort, and love the questions themselves. And so my hope here at the end of another episode is that you have some questions. You sit with some of these tensions that Brandon and I are maybe still walking out of here with, and that you find the courage to ask a good question, not just for our show, but in any aspect of your life.
Beautiful. I love it. And we got a pastor with his collar on to say Boogaloo multiple times. So
That's true.
This was a great episode.
Sorry, I'm just ready for the TikTok compilation of me saying Boogaloo over and over.
So
if
good.
Anybody
so
has
fun.
A lot of free time on their hands. All right. Well, we will see you next Tuesday live at 9 p.m. Central. And otherwise, we'll talk to you soon. Ask a good question.
Ask a good question.